Hi everyone. This is our second strategy concepts video, and it's going to be about the topic of value creation and value capture. There's a school of thought that thinks you can view all of the topic of strategy as being about the process of firms trying to take actions that make the total amount of value created as large as possible, and then capturing as big as possible a share of that large pie. So when consultants and business school professors talk about value, what they're really discussing is the economic idea of welfare, whether they know it or not. And what welfare is really just the same thing as net benefits. It's total benefits minus total costs to all the actors or the parties in a system. In our case, that system is going to have three kinds of parties in it: a firm, its suppliers, and its customers. So it's easy to think about value in the following way, in terms of a value chain. So there's maybe a flow of goods or services, right? So there's some suppliers, and in this case you want to think about the suppliers as anyone that the firm pays some money to. And they sell inputs to a firm at some cost, or sort of at price that is a cost for the focal firm. Focal firm incurs some expenses to produce an output, a final good, which they sell at a price to some buyers. And so the costs and the prices determine the allocation of value between customers, who you can think of as capturing buyer profit or consumer surplus, the firm, who makes its share of the total pie, its profit, and the suppliers, who also get a bit of the profit. This picture, sort of just a vertical bar with the average cost and the price on it, showing how the total value gets divided up between buyers, suppliers, and firms, is often called a value stick. And we'll use value sticks to think about unit value creation and value capture, sort of the economics of an industry on a per customer or per transaction, per dollar of sales kind of basis. So in this sort of system, let's talk about what total value and value creation and value capture mean. So the total value created in this system is the size of the total stick. It's the difference between a firm's customers' willingness to pay for the product, which is to say the maximum amount they would possibly be willing to pay for the good, which is sort of an upper bound on price, an idea that we'll talk about in a minute, minus the supplier's average cost, right? That's the lowest price that a supplier would take to sell its inputs to the firm. Right, and so the total value created, or the total welfare here, is going to be the gap all the way between what a customer is willing to pay and what a supplier is willing to sell for. Okay, and then the value that gets captured by a firm is the difference between the price it can actually charge, which always has to be lower than the buyer's willingness to pay, and the costs that it actually pays, which always have to be above the supplier's own internal costs. Right, so the value captured is essentially just a firm's unit profits, where value created, is total welfare. Sorry about that. Which is the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the supplier's average cost. Okay, so let's make the links between these ideas and economics a little more explicit. You can think of the value stick, which I've now moved over to the right part of the slide here, as being just one vertical slice from the old demand curve pictures that you might have remembered from economics. So here's the demand curve, this darker black line sloping diagonally downward on the screen. That gives you the total amount sold, quantity, which is here on this x-axis, as a function of the price. Right, so here's the price that we're thinking about the firm charging. And you'll notice that corresponds to the price over here on our value stick. Well, what's willingness to pay? Remember we had, if we go back one slide, the top line on our value stick was buyer willingness to pay. Well, it's really just the difference between what the firm actually charges and the most a consumer would be willing to pay for an average consumer. And so here we sort of take the average of all of these different consumers. You can think about the consumers as lined up here on the x-axis. Right, so if you remember economics, this whole triangle is actually what consumer surplus is. But you can think of there being one kind of marginal consumer or average consumer who's right here, and this is the most that they would be willing to pay. And so we can track that line all the way over here and think of that as willingness to pay. And so you get sort of a vertical version of consumer surplus here on the value stick, whereas if we're doing this rigorously using the economics and demand curve, we would take this whole area under the triangle. Similarly, right, the vertical area here is the firm's profit from the value stick. If we think about it on a demand curve, the profit is the difference between the price and the average cost. That's this vertical piece, the unit. And you think of it as the profit per one unit times the number of units, which is the distance here of quantity, which is determined by price, right? What you can see in the demand curve that you can't see with a value stick is the trade-off between setting a high price and increasing your margins and having lower volumes when you charge a higher price. And then we put the average costs of the supplier down here. That's the lower bound on the profit box. And we said the supplier's own costs have to be something greater than zero. They don't necessarily correspond to anything from the demand curve picture. And so our value sticks really do come out of the economics of profit maximizing price setting decisions by firm. But what we think of the value stick as is just a simplified way of looking at, on a single unit basis, how does the pie, or the total amount of value created, get divided up between buyers, firms, and their suppliers. Okay, so what's the point of going through all this? Is it just to simplify the demand curve? No, actually the value stick idea sort of illustrates a couple of important points. So the first is it shows us that there are really two constraints or two fundamental limitations on the amount of value that a firm can capture. One set of constraints comes simply from what we would think of as the primitives of the environment, the demand, or sort of customers' desires and wants and needs, and the costs, or the technology that's used to produce the inputs. Right? And how do we think of those as exercising constraints? Well, we already hinted at the intuition. Right? If a firm is really good at value capture, it may be able to raise its price and raise its price and raise its price, but it's never going to be able to raise its price above a customer's willingness to pay. Because at that point, the customer has the option of simply opting out. They won't buy the good. Right? And so the demand, or willingness to pay, puts a constraint on, it's an upper bound on what price the firm can charge. Similarly, it may be really good at squeezing its suppliers. It can squeeze costs and squeeze costs. But at some point, the suppliers are going to say, you know what? Selling you a unit below this price implies that I'm losing money on the transaction, so I'm just not going to do it. Right? And so the supplier's average cost puts fundamentally a lower bound on what a firm can get. Right? And so the first fundamental constraint on value capture simply comes from demand and costs. The second comes from competition. Right? So now I have up here two value sticks, and you could imagine they correspond to two different firms. Right? And the point here is if the firm on the left is charging a lower price, there's a downward pressure on the price of the firm on the right. Right? We're going to assume these are two sticks corresponding to two firms competing in the same industry. Why is that? Well, think about the problem from a consumer's point of view. The consumer is choosing between left stick and right stick. And left stick is offering them a much bigger share of the pie. It's offering more consumer surplus. That's going to cause consumers to shift towards left stick, which means right stick is losing market share. Right? How can it fight back against left stick? Well, it can drop its price, offering them a greater share of the pie themselves. Right? This should be also a familiar intuition from economics. It's just that firms in the same industry compete on price, and when they compete on price, they're creating a good deal for consumers. Okay? So competition also imposes constraints on value capture, as you can see when you generalize to a case of two sticks instead of one. That influence of competition then has two interesting kinds of implications for our purposes. The first is that in a stable industry, firms have to be offering consumers roughly similar deals. Okay? In other words, they have to be offering roughly equal consumer surplus. The size of the gap between willingness to pay and price of two firms in the same industry has to be about the same. Doesn't mean that they have to be generating the same willingness to pay, as we'll see in a second, or charging the same price. It's just that the gap between price and willingness to pay has to be roughly equal. Right? And the big star here is saying, look, that's assuming a stable market. It could be that one firm, if we go back to this picture, is offering a much better deal than the other. And how do we know that that's going on from looking at real-world data? Well, we can see that one firm is growing at the expense of the other. It's gaining share. But in a stable market, they have to be offering about the same amount of consumer surplus. What's the second implication? The second implication follows right from the first one. It's that differences in prices between two firms, which you can see, should be roughly equal to the differences in willingness to pay, which you can't see. Right? So here I show this by sort of saying, imagine that firm 2 now has a worse product. It doesn't generate the same willingness to pay. But the shares are roughly stable, right? The market shares of these two firms, and they both are competing with each other in the market. Well, what does that mean? That means that the difference in price between the left stick and the right stick is about the same as the difference in the willingness to pay. And right, so this X here is the difference in the willingness to pays, and this X here is the differences in the prices. Why is it that we can't observe willingness to pay? Well, think about this one yourself. What kind of information are you likely to get if you go and simply ask customers, what are you willing to pay for my good? Do they have an incentive to tell you the truth or not? So given that we can't understand or easily measure willingness to pay without making some strong assumptions, what we're often going to do is look at differences in firms' unit prices and use that as a proxy for differences in the amount of value that they're creating, because we know that they correspond to differences in willingness to pay. Okay, so now that we know what the two constraints on value capture imposed by competition are, and we know what some of the implications of that of competition for thinking about value creation and value capture are, how can we use this information? Well, one way is when we go and we start to look at firms that are positioned differently. We say some of these firms are sort of average. They charge about the average price and have the average costs. Others are low-cost competitors, or others are premium competitors or differentiators. We actually can sort of make those inferences that way I just described on the last slide about the differences in their the willingness to pay generated by those firms right off of the differences in price, right? So if we see that a firm is charging a lower price, as long as it's not rapidly gaining market share, we know that it's leaving about the same amount of surplus on the table for its consumers as other firms at a higher price. And that's a powerful insight. Often it's counterintuitive for us to think about firms that are low costs firms competing with firms that are differentiators in the same market. We like to think that Walmart isn't competing with Neiman Marcus, but in fact it is. Because if it was offering a much better deal, right, these are both places where customers can go to get similar things, even if the level of service and the quality of goods is different. If one generated considerably more consumer surplus for the average customer than the other, you would see a rapidly changing allocation of market shares in that kind of a segment. So we can use our ideas of the value stick to kind of think about the unit economics of differently positioned customers. And then we can go from there to thinking about the activities that a firm uses to position itself and how those activities actually translate into willingness to pay and costs, right? And the way I'm trying to illustrate that on this slide is to say, look, if we just write down the function for a firm's profits, which are the quantity it sells, which is a function of price and all of the other stuff that a firm does to generate willingness to pay, times the firm's margins, which are its price minus its average costs. And those average costs are a function of quantity and everything else the firm does to sort of drive down costs, right? Then we can analyze firms' competitive positions in terms of how do activities influence willingness to pay and costs. And we understand from analyzing value sticks and thinking about value creation and value capture how the activities translate into value, sort of the total value in the system, and how they might influence competition and therefore drive the amount of value that a firm can actually capture. And we'll talk a little bit about how differentiating between value creation and value capture helps us to think about and understand better the choices of activities that firms make when they decide on their competitive positions.